The stray dog was cruelly tied up and dragged by a motorbike. What happened next will break your heart and make you cry. Would you believe if I told you that a dog dragged by a motorcycle once again trusted humans, and today saves lives with his love? The question seems unlikely, even absurd, but the story of Max, a simple stray with a sweet look and a resilient heart, proves that the impossible can happen, especially when it comes to unconditional love. In times when cruelty seems to gain space in the headlines, stories like Max's rekindle a spark of hope, a silent reminder that there is still something pure in the world, and it all starts with a look. Have you ever stopped to notice how a dog's eyes can say everything, even without a single word? Max's look in particular had something different about it. It wasn't just tenderness nor just sadness. It was a look that carried the weight of the world and at the same time an immense desire to continue living and to love, despite everything. Max didn't have a name when it all started. It was just one more among so many stray dogs that roamed a small town forgotten on the map. He walked the sidewalks as if looking for something he lost, or perhaps never had, a home. People saw him, some even threw food scraps, but few stopped to really look at him. Maybe that's why his eyes screamed so much. They screamed for a little attention, for affection, for belonging. And it was precisely when he least expected it, and needed it most, that he experienced the worst of human beings. On that sultry Friday morning, Max just sniffed the ground in search of something that could satisfy his hunger. He was distracted, as always, innocent. He didn't see the boy approaching with the rope in his hands. He didn't understand why they were tying his neck in such a hurry. And when the motorcycle took off, he also didn't understand why his skin was burning and his paws were trying to keep up with an impossible pace. Max's screams of pain mixed with the noise of the engine and the cruel laughter that echoed like a knife in the ears of anyone who happened to witness that scene. But no one stopped. Nobody intervened. Nobody saved Max. That wasn't just a physical attack. It was an open wound in the soul of a being who only wanted to love. The hot asphalt burned, but what hurt most was the betrayal. Because even though he never had an owner, Max always believed in the kindness of people. He always wagged his tail when someone passed by. He always approached in search of affection, not scraps. Now all was silence and pain. Max was left lying like trash on the edge of a bush, dirty, bleeding, without even the strength to bark. It was the end, or at least it seemed like it, and this is where the story could have ended. But it didn't end, because Max's heart was still beating, and as long as there is heart, there is hope. Have you ever noticed how some animals simply refuse to give up, even when everything around them seems lost? It's as if they have a strength within them that comes from a place that we humans have perhaps forgotten how to access. Max had that strength, and with it he crawled, 1 centimeter at a time, bleeding, sobbing in silence. He dragged himself to the only place where he had ever felt a little welcome, Donna Lucia's door. Donna Lucia was a lady with white hair and teary eyes. She lived alone since her husband left, and filled the silence with prayers, memories, and small acts of kindness, like leaving a bowl of food outside the house. And it was that pot, and perhaps the smell of a brief but welcoming past, that guided Max to her. When the elderly woman opened the door and saw that pile of pain folded in on itself, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't need words to understand that someone had done something terrible. He bent down slowly, without scaring him, and touched his head with the same delicacy as someone holding something broken. At that moment, Max felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: safety. But is security enough to erase the trauma? In the days that followed, Max fought for his life. With the help of volunteers and veterinarians from the small local NGO, he received care, medication, and affection. But more than anything, he was given time. Time to heal on the outside and also on the inside. The most surprising thing, however, was not his physical recovery, although it was a true miracle. What impressed everyone around the most was something simple and almost unbelievable. Even after everything, Max still trusted people. Its tail wagged shyly when someone approached. His eyes, still marked by pain, searched for connection. He didn't growl. He didn't back away. He just loved, as if to say, "I know what they did to me, but you're not that person. You can be better." This is where the mystery of the dog's soul begins to reveal itself. How can someone so mistreated still be capable of affection? How is it possible that, even after being dragged by a motorcycle, Max still approaches human hands with an open heart? Maybe it's because dogs don't love out of fear of disappointment. They just love it. Integers, no filters, no reservations. And that love began to heal more than just his own wounds. It was during a visit to the shelter that a psychologist noticed something extraordinary. Max, even among so many other dogs, had something different. When a child with anxiety touched him for the first time, his body calmed down. A depressed elderly man smiled after weeks of not reacting. Max had the gift of transforming the environment with his presence, and suddenly, that story of suffering began to take a new turn. But that is a topic for the next chapter. After all, can you imagine what happens when a dog marked by pain decides to become the cure for other pains? Get ready, because Max's journey is just beginning. Have you ever noticed how, even in the most forgotten places, where it seems like life passes by without haste and without witnesses, there are stories that scream for attention, even if in silence? In that small country town, where time seemed to move slower and the days repeated themselves with the monotony of old routines, there was a dusty, narrow and full of potholes, which was barely visible on the maps, a street that few walked by choice. In it, cars passed by as if passing by, without looking to the side, without listening to anything other than their own engines. But there in that forgotten part of the world, a story began to unfold, a story marked by abandonment, pain, and surprisingly, love. The scenery was dry. The faded walls of the humblest houses contrasted with the shy greens that insisted on growing between the cracks in the concrete. The horns of the few cars mixed with the occasional bark of a distant dog, and amid this colorless landscape, Max walked. Or better said, I tried to walk. His paws hurt. The sun beat down on his caramel fur, now dirty and opaque. The heat of the asphalt burned like hot coals beneath his already injured feet. For anyone who looked quickly, Max was just another street dog, like so many that roam the invisible outskirts of cities. But there was something different about him. Maybe it was the way he observed the world, and with a mixture of hope and weariness. Maybe it was the way he always approached people, even when he was ignored. Or maybe it was that look that said so much and asked for so little. Max didn't know the comfort of a bed, the sound of a loving voice calling his name, nor the touch of hands that don't hurt. His reality was made of scraps of food, of affection, of attention. But even so, he insisted on existing with a dignity that only animals have. And no matter how tough the street was, he never stopped believing that, at some point, something could change. There, in that simple neighborhood, there were few people who noticed his presence. Most passed by it, as if it were part of the landscape, an obstacle between the gate and work. But there was someone who saw Max, someone who, although silent, did more for him than anyone had ever done. Donna Lucia. Elderly, widowed and lonely, Donna Lucia was known for her discreet kindness. She had lived alone since losing her husband more than a decade ago. His children, each with their own distant lives, called from time to time, but rarely showed up. She filled her days with memories, plants, and prayers. And whenever he could, he left a small bowl of food and water near the gate. He didn't say anything, he didn't call Max, but he knew. I knew that gesture was a silent invitation, a sign that, at least there, he was welcome. Over time, Max started to visit the front of her house every day. He sat next to the pot, with his tongue out and his eyes serene. Sometimes, when she appeared at the door with her cup of tea, their eyes would meet. Not a word was said, but there was a trade-off, a connection, a silent kind of love that needs no explanations. That piece of sidewalk became Max's shelter. He slept next to the wall, where the shade of the tree offered him some relief on the hottest days. Neighbors would occasionally throw a piece of stale bread or call his name with some affectionate variation, even without knowing who he was. Max became part of that place, invisible to many, but essential to the silent soul of the street. Have you ever noticed how sometimes life can change in a single instant? How can a moment divide the before and after of an entire existence? For Max, this moment came without warning, without logic, without any reason that made sense. And when he arrived, he took with him everything that remained of stability in that already fragile world. Max already knew the pain. I knew the cold of abandonment, the hunger that tears inside, the loneliness that screams in the alleys when the silence of the night becomes unbearable. But still, even in the face of all this, he was a trusting dog, a dog who believed in people even when most of them ignored him. That dusty street where he spent his days was his refuge, his world. He didn't ask for much, just a little attention, a quick affection, a gesture of care. And when that came, even if rarely, he reciprocated with what he knew best: pure, sincere, and non-judgmental love. That was why he always approached with his tail wagging, even when someone was rushing past. That was why he sat next to old Donna Lucia, without expecting anything in return. And perhaps that's why it's so difficult to understand what happened that day, because when it comes to human cruelty, sometimes there is no sustainable explanation. That morning, the sun had barely reached the highest point in the sky when Max, in his usual innocence, approached a group of teenagers who were laughing loudly near the square. He didn't know that laughter, in that case, was not synonymous with joy. He didn't notice the strange tone, the evil look, the silence that preceded the brutal gesture. Perhaps if he had lived less time on the streets, he would have learned to protect himself better. But Max didn't know how to escape affection, not even when the affection was disguised as a threat. It was too fast for any hope to react. One of the boys, young face, restless look, one of those who still confuse courage with cruelty, was holding an old, dirty, rough rope. Max looked at him curiously, his brown eyes reflecting an innocence that only street dogs know, that of someone who, even having experienced abandonment, still believes that a human gesture can be synonymous with affection. The rope passed around his neck as so many hands had passed before, without explanation. He didn't bark, he didn't move away, he didn't defend himself. For a second, he thought it was a joke. Perhaps one of these boys had taken pity on him and wanted to take him home. A sweet and naive thought, which appeared at the exact moment reality decided to destroy everything. The roar of the motorcycle broke the silence like a muffled scream. The engine accelerated violently, vibrating like a caged animal about to attack. Max felt the sudden pull, pain exploding from his neck and spreading throughout his body. And it was at that moment that everything inside him broke. He tried to run, but there was no time. The fragile paws tried to find the rhythm of the machine, but the ground seemed to slip away from beneath their feet. The asphalt, scorching, cut like broken glass. Every meter traveled opened a new wound. The nails broke, the skin was torn, the heat burned relentlessly, and the screams, oh, the screams. Max had never screamed like that. It was a hoarse, desperate sound that didn't just come from the throat, it came from the soul. A lament that echoed for all the injustices he had already endured, but that now overflowed, because this time it was too much. This time it hurt deeper. It wasn't just the body that was being dragged. It was his faith. It was his innocence. It was the little trust he still had left in humans. He looked around, between one blow and another, looking for eyes that would save him, of voices that called him back. But all he found was silence. Anyone who saw it from afar froze. Anyone who saw it up close turned their face away. The windows closed. The doors locked. The street, which previously sheltered his slow and peaceful steps, now became a corridor of pain and omission. Every inch he walked was a piece of himself left behind, pieces of skin, of spirit, of hope. It was as if the entire world was silent, watching the execution of a being who had only asked for love. And that silence hurt more than any burn. The cowardice wasn't just in the hands of the boy who held the rope with nervous laughter and empty eyes. It was also among those who did nothing, those who saw and crossed their arms, those who heard the screams and preferred not to get involved. Because at that moment, Max wasn't betrayed by just one. He was betrayed by everyone. When the motorcycle finally stopped, Max fell to the ground like an inert body. He breathed, yes, but he wasn't the same puppy. Something inside him had died along the way. Something precious. Perhaps it was the last spark of confidence, or perhaps the desire to continue believing that the world, despite everything, could still be good. There, lying on the edge of the bush, covered in blood and dust, Max didn't know what would become of himself. But one thing was certain, the Max who trusted, who ran to meet any human with his tail wagging, that Max had been dragged away. And maybe, just maybe, what was left now would be silence. A heavy silence, bitter and irreversibly sad. His body was covered in wounds, his paws raw. Blood marked the path he had passed, like a silent trail of pain. But what hurt most, more than the exposed flesh, more than the cracked bones, was the feeling of having been betrayed. Because Max never expected to be loved like a house puppy, with a nice collar and a soft walk, but he also never imagined that someone could hurt him on purpose, that someone could do that and find it funny. Abandoned in a vacant lot, as if he were a discarded object, Max remained motionless. The pain was so much that even breathing seemed like an impossible effort. But the cruelest thing was the silence. There was no sound of comfort, no look of pity, no gesture of help. It was him and the key. Pain. Just that. And it was there on that dry, rough ground that Max had his first death. Not the body. That would come later, in other forms. But the death of innocence. The breach of trust. The definitive break with the illusion that all humans are good. It's hard to imagine what goes on in an animal's mind in that state. There are no words. There are no verbalized laments. But the eyes say it all. And anyone who saw Max there at that moment would understand without effort. He didn't know if he wanted to continue. I didn't know if it was worth fighting, because the world had become a cold, hostile, merciless place, and he was alone. But it is precisely in the darkest moments that sometimes the light finds a crack to enter. Have you ever felt powerless in the face of something so cruel, so unfair, that everything inside you screams for justice, but the world remains silent? The scenes of what happened to Max were recorded by someone who, by luck or divine providence, was there with a cell phone in their hands. Within seconds, the images spread across the internet like a fire that could no longer be put out. They were too harsh to be ignored, too visceral not to touch anyone's heart with a modicum of compassion. The video showed the moment when Max was brutally dragged by a motorcycle, his body surrendered to pain, his soul being torn apart with every meter traveled, and deep down, an even more disturbing detail: laughter. They laughed at him. Laugh at your pain. The outrage was immediate. Angry comments spread across the networks, protest hashtags were created, activists demanded action. For a moment it seemed like something would be done, that the collective voice of the internet would not let this crime go unpunished. But it wasn't quite like that. There was no arrest, there was no accountability. Those involved were identified, yes, but the consequences were light, almost symbolic. They claimed that it was a joke that got out of control, that they didn't know the dog would get hurt so much. Empty, cold words, as if Max's life were a minor detail in a distorted narrative. And then, what was a scream turned into frustration. The initial revolt turned into resigned silence. And Max was left to his own devices. While the culprits went on with their lives, protected by bureaucracy and neglect, he agonized on the margins of society, injured not only in his body, but in everything that was still human in his eyes. The world failed Max, that's a fact. Not just justice, but everyone who could have done more and didn't. Those who looked away, those who remained silent, those who rationalized the irrational. The feeling of injustice hung in the air like a dense, heavy, suffocating cloud. And that is where the deepest pain lies, knowing that the pain of an innocent person was not enough to truly move the system that was supposed to protect him. But if on the one hand the world failed, Max did not fail. Himself. There was something inside him that refused to give up, a stubborn flame lit amidst the rubble of a destroyed body that insisted on saying, "It's not over yet." The pain was unbearable. The open wounds turned every movement into torture. His paws were raw, some of his nails had broken, and his entire body was shaking with fever, fear, and exhaustion. But he moved. Little by little, inch by inch, Max crawled. It was as if his soul knew where to go, even when his body screamed to stop. And so, dragging himself as best he could, he crossed streets, corners, stretches of dirt and gravel, until he reached the only door in the world that in some way represented refuge, Donna Lucia's door. She was inside, as always, making her Annie's tea. His slow movements betrayed his age, but also the delicacy of someone who had learned to listen to the world with their heart. And that was why, when she heard a muffled sound outside, a low moan, almost a whisper, something inside her woke up. Chill ran down his spine. It wasn't just any sound, it was a calling. When she turned the key and opened the old wooden door that creaked as usual, Donna Lucia never imagined that she would have before her a scene capable of breaking even the most resilient of hearts. The heat of the afternoon still hung in the air, and for a moment she thought there was something wrong with her eyes. Maybe it was the clarity, maybe the time playing tricks. But no, it was real. And what he saw there, at his feet, made his heart almost stop. Max, that little dog that visited her every day with his tail wagging, that rested at her door like a silent angel, was now fallen, surrendered, reduced to a thin and injured body. It looked more like a dirty rag than a living being. His fur, once golden and dusty, was caked with dried blood. The open wounds told without words the story of a suffering that no creature should know. His eyes, oh, his eyes, were glassy, distant, as if he were between two worlds. But he was breathing, weak, irregular, almost imperceptible, but he was breathing. Donna Lucia brought her hand to her mouth in an instinctive gesture of shock. Time seemed to freeze. The whole world was reduced to that piece of sidewalk where Max, with the last of his strength, had crawled. He came back. He returned to the only place where, at some point in his life, he felt loved. Not because he believed that someone would save him, but because there, in that door, there was a memory of warmth, of kindness, of peace, and that was where he wanted to go back before the dark took him for good. She couldn't speak. The words were lost between his throat and his heart. In silence, he knelt. His knees, battered by the years, creaked like the wood on the porch. But she didn't even feel pain. There was something bigger there, something that made me ache inside. With trembling hands, she touched Max's head with an almost maternal lightness. He felt the feverish heat of his body, his weak breathing, the fragility of someone who had already surpassed all limits. His fingers slowly ran over his ears, his cheeks, his chafed shoulders, and then, with his other hand, he covered his eyes and said a silent prayer. He didn't ask for miracles. He did not demand justice. He just begged in whispers for God not to let that being go. Not now. Not like that. He cried, but he didn't cry out of despair. He cried out of impotence, because there was something cruel about seeing such pain without being able to erase it. He cried because he understood at that moment that Max's pain wasn't just his. It was the pain of a world that forgets the fragile, who remains silent in the face of evil, that abandons the most loyal. Slowly, with a sinking heart, she pulled out an old blanket that was hanging behind the door. It was a worn fabric, with stains from time, but it was what she had. With all the care in the world, he wrapped Max in that cloth, as if he were cradling an injured child. His body was light, frighteningly light, and yet each step into the house felt like it weighed tons. The modest room, with little furniture and many old portraits, became a sanctuary of care. She laid him down on a towel spread out on the floor, right next to his favorite armchair. He grabbed a bowl of fresh water, but Max didn't move. He passed a damp cloth over his wounds, unable to contain the tears that flowed in silence. His fragile body trembled, but there was there, in that look that opened, from time to time a silent plea, "Don't give up on me." And she didn't give up. Donna Lucia had no resources. There was no car to take him to a clinic. I didn't have a modern telephone, nor did I know how to upload something on the internet. But she had something the entire world had denied Max: compassion. That compassion that doesn't need to be taught. That comes from the purest instinct of those who can't bear to see someone suffer and turn their backs. Deep down, maybe she knew she couldn't save him alone, but it could be there. I could help. I could do what I could. And sometimes the possible is what changes everything. That night, Donna Lucia didn't sleep. She stood next to him, murmuring words that he might not even hear, but that filled the room with warmth. As she stroked her ears, she remembered her deceased husband, the loneliness that had accompanied her for years, and he realized that somehow Max also filled a space that no one else could touch. It wasn't just a street dog. It was a piece of good that still remained in the world, a fragment of love that, even bleeding, had returned to her. There, in that simple room, on a night marked by pain and tenderness, two wounded hearts found shelter in each other. And when dawn finally turned into morning, something inside her knew Max still had a way to go. And what she didn't imagine was how much this path would transform lives, including hers. Have you ever stopped to think about how, even after going through the worst, some animals still manage to look at us with tenderness? How is it possible that even after abandonment, pain and injustice, a dog can trust again? To many, this seems unlikely, almost impossible. But for Max, that's exactly what happened. After that night when he collapsed on Donna Lucia's door, covered in wounds and hope, something began to change. Slowly, at the right time, like the things that really matter. What happened there was the first step, the most painful and silent, of a rebirth. Donna Lucia, with her simple faith and trembling hands, did what she could with the little she had. But he soon realized he needed help, and that's when something unexpected started to happen. People started arriving. A young volunteer at a local shelter named Clara heard about the story from a neighbor. When he saw Max lying on a towel on the floor of the elderly woman's living room, he felt his chest tighten. She called the NGO she was part of, which mobilized a small support network. Medicines arrived, clean blankets arrived, words of comfort arrived, hands arrived. Hands that didn't hit, didn't pull ropes, didn't drag. Hands that cared. The recovery process was slow. Max had fevers, infections, relapses. He needed to be sedated so that the deeper wounds could be treated. Every bath was a challenge, every movement, a battle against pain. And yet, he accepted, not with submission, but with a kind of surrender that came from trust. He looked into the eyes of whoever, approached as if to say, "If you came to help, I'll let you." And he left. It was as if he knew deep down that something had changed, that now, unlike what he had experienced before, he was surrounded by people who cared, that there were hands that didn't hurt, that there was a new warmth around him, and it was this environment, this reunion with care, that began to heal not only his body, but his soul. But what no one expected, what surprised even the most experienced caregivers, was what happened late in the afternoon. A few days after his second hospitalization, Clara had come back to visit him as she always did. She entered the room of the small improvised clinic with calm steps, speaking softly, afraid of waking him. But Max wasn't sleeping. I was watching. And when he saw her, something inside him lit up. His body was still weak. He couldn't run or jump. But his tail started moving, first slowly, almost shyly, then more firmly. A light shake, but full of meaning. It was as if he said, "You're back. I remember you. Thank you." The nurse, seeing this, put her hands to her mouth and began to cry. And it wasn't the only one. Clara knelt down beside him, caressed his head gently and let the tears fall. Not out of sadness, this time out of surprise, of emotion, of gratitude, because that simple gesture, that wagging tail, said more than 1,000 words. Max, despite everything, still loved humans. How was it possible? How could a being who had been tortured, abandoned, forgotten, still trust? Could you still show affection? It defied all logic. But perhaps dogs, like angels, do not obey human logic. They love in essence. They forgive by nature. They trust, not because they forgot, but because they chose to move on. That was the first major turning point in Max's story, not the physical recovery, which would still take time, but the return of hope, the rebirth of connection, the reunion with love. From then on, something also started to change in the people around him. The volunteers began to treat him not just as an animal in recovery, but as a symbol, a living reminder that kindness is still possible, that even in the darkest scenarios, there is still room for light. Max inspired. Silently, without demanding anything, he taught. The days passed. The hair started to grow back. The wounds healed little by little. He still walked with a limp, still felt pain, but he never stopped observing the movement of the clinic, with that deep, sweet, almost human gaze. And whenever someone new approached, Max looked carefully. If he felt truth in the gesture, his tail would wag. His trust wasn't blind, it was sensitive. He felt who came with love, and he reciprocated. It was during this period that the first smiles began to appear, where before there were only tears. Children were going to visit him with their parents. Some of them were afraid of puppies until they met Max. Never barked. He just approached calmly and placed his nose on the hand of the person who needed affection, as if to say, "Trust me, I understand." And he understood. Max unintentionally became a healer of souls, even without being fully cured, and perhaps that is precisely what made it so special. He was real. It was living proof that pain leaves marks, but it doesn't need to define who you are. That suffering is part of the journey, but it doesn't have to be the end of it. Max, with his silent story, told everyone, "I was hurt, but I chose to love." This first turning point, the reunion with love, was not just a milestone in Max's trajectory. It was a watershed in the lives of everyone who crossed his path. Because when you saw that tail wag after everything he'd been through, you couldn't help but get emotional. There was no way not to rethink the world, the attitudes, the look we give to the vulnerable. And as Max continued his recovery, a question began to grow in the hearts of those who accompanied him. What if this dog, who was already dragged and humiliated, could one day bring love to other people hurt like him? It was a distant idea, but who said Max wasn't capable of miracles? After all, he had already done the hardest thing. He chose to live and love, even when the world told him he shouldn't. And what would come next? No one imagined, not even Max. Have you ever noticed how some animals seem to have a special gift, something almost invisible, that touches our hearts in a way that we can't always explain? There are dogs that just by being present can calm an agitated soul, wipe away a tear without even having to lick a face. Max was like that, or rather, he became like that, because it didn't happen overnight. Before that, it took time, care, and something even more difficult, rebuilding trust. After the first twist, when Max finally showed that he was still capable of wagging his tail at humans, everyone around understood that they were facing something rare, a being who, even torn apart by evil, chose to trust. And this choice, as silent as it was powerful, was the beginning of a new phase. Max now needed to learn to live without fear, or at least not to let it dominate him. The scars on his body were still there, some closed, others sensitive to touch, but the deepest scars were those that could not be seen, those that were inside, where no bandage could reach. And that's why every gesture of affection, every hand extended, every patient look was so important. It was as if day after day they asked Max for permission to rewrite his story with a new ink, that of trust, and he left. With each new visit to the shelter, Max showed a little more of who he was before the pain. When children arrived, with light steps and curious eyes, he observed them for a few seconds, as if assessing the energy of the environment, and then he would approach, without rushing, putting his nose on an open hand, or lying down at their feet as if to say, "Don't be afraid, I'm learning." 2. The elderly also sought him out. Many came to visit the shelter to deal with their own losses, their own loneliness. Some barely spoke, but when I saw Max, something changed. A sparkle would appear in the eyes, a word would emerge, an old memory would emerge. Max didn't do anything great, and perhaps that was his greatest power. He was just present, whole, welcoming, the way only animals know how to be when they decide to trust again. The shelter, previously just a place for rescued dogs, began to transform into something different. People came not only to adopt, but to meet Max, to sit next to him and feel that silent peace that he spread wherever he went. He was no longer the dog dragged by the motorcycle. Now he was the healing dog. Still no official title, but with a very clear role, helping to cure invisible pain. It was in this scenario that she appeared, the psychologist. Her name was Helena. She came to the shelter from time to time as a volunteer, offering to listen to people going through difficult processes, and also, whenever possible, giving emotional support to the animals' caregivers themselves. Helena was sensitive, observant, and in just a few minutes with Max, he understood what many took days to realize. There was something about him that wasn't common. She was silent for a while, just watching him interact with a lady who had lost her husband. Max approached the woman gently. He sat next to her without touching, as if he knew that the space needed to be respected. And when the woman started to cry, he just lay down, resting his chin on his paws, looking at her. There was no need to bark, jump, or party. The simple fact of being there, silent and present, was enough. Helena saw everything, and there was a snap. That same day, when talking to those responsible for the shelter, he shared a bold idea. He asked if they could allow Max to go through an evaluation and adaptation process to become a therapy dog. Yes, she knew about his past. I knew every pain, every trauma, but I also knew that sometimes the greatest healers are those who have already bled. And Max had everything to be that. The proposal was received with surprise. Some hesitated. Others found it dangerous. But Helena insisted. He explained that the process would be careful, supervised, and carried out in stages, and that, if Max was really ready, he could help a lot of people, maybe hundreds of them, because he wasn't just a survivor, he was an example, a source of living inspiration. And that's how it all started. The training was not just technical. Of course, there were commands, protocols, adaptations, but the most important thing was to respect Max's time. The first step was to take him to different environments, an office, a school, a hospital waiting room. In each place they watched how he reacted. He felt scared, if he withdrew, if you needed breaks. But with each new challenge, Max surprised. He walked beside Helena with firm steps, without pulling on the leash. He looked around, sniffed, but always calmly. When he found someone sad, he approached them in the same way, silent, respectful, present. And the reactions were always the same. People smiled, some were crying, others just remained silent, feeling that moment like an invisible hug. The most beautiful thing was seeing how Max, despite carrying such a painful story, did not show fear. There was no suspicion in his gaze. There was calm, a calm that said, "I know what it's like to suffer. But I also know that there is love in the world, and I'm here to remind you of that." Helena started recording everything. I took photos, I took note of behaviors, I recorded short videos. Little by little, he built a dossier on Max, not as a rescued dog, but as a therapist in training. And the more he recorded, the more certain he became that his intuition was right. In one of these sessions, an autistic boy, who avoided physical contact and rarely spoke, was taken to Max. His parents were apprehensive but agreed to try. The boy, upon seeing the dog, stopped. It was static. Max did what he did best. He didn't force anything, just sat down, waited, and after a few minutes, the boy took a step, and then another, until he extended his hand. He touched the dog's back with his fingertips and smiled. It was the first time in a long time that his parents had seen him smile like that. At that moment, everyone understood that Max had found his purpose, and the most impressive. He never needed words because sometimes love doesn't speak, he just is. And Max, he was pure, healing, silent love, and now, necessary. And so, the dog that one day was dragged by a motorcycle, humiliated and left to die, began to follow a new path. A path where your pain would be transformed into hope, where your story would stop being just about survival and become about transformation. But this was just the beginning of something even bigger. Because Max now wasn't just healing himself. He began to heal the world around him, and what would happen next, no one could predict. Have you ever had the feeling of being in front of something sacred, even if you don't quite understand why? Sometimes it's not a church, not a moment of prayer, but the silent look of a dog that sits next to you and seems to see what no one else sees. Max was like that, or rather, Max became this. The dog who was once dragged by a motorcycle, who had already known the taste of the rawest pain and the most revolting injustice, now had a new role, and it was perhaps the most important of his life. After so many comings and goings, adaptation sessions and transformative encounters, Max's transformation was practically complete. But what was impressive was not just his physical recovery. That in itself was a miracle. He walked without a limp. His fur had grown back, the wounds had closed, and most of the visible scars no longer hurt to the touch. What touched those who knew him most was something else, something that could not be measured with exams or reports. It was the energy he emanated, a kind of serene presence that calmed even the most turbulent environments. Helena, the psychologist who bet on him from the beginning, said that Max had the gift of silence. He didn't need to do anything extraordinary. It was enough to be. His look was like a hug. His touch, when he touched his nose to someone who was sad or anxious, was more efficient than long. Conversations. People in emotional crisis found solace only in his company. Autistic children who could barely interact with the world around them opened up when they were with him. Elderly people in nursing homes, many already forgotten by their own families, smiled again after his visit. Max didn't speak, but it said it all. And then, after months of careful training and therapeutic experiences, closely monitored by specialized professionals, the official moment came. Max was certified as a therapy dog. It was a symbolic but emotional day. No lavish ceremonies, red carpets, or shiny medals. Just a group of people who believed in him. Volunteers, veterinarians, therapists, children, and elderly people coming together to celebrate the impossible. The certificate was a simple piece of paper, lovingly signed by Helena, with the stamp of the partner NGO and a symbolic seal of the assisted therapy project. But it represented much more than recognition. It was a silent victory over the past. It was the end of a cycle of pain and the beginning of a purpose. Max wore his blue vest with a small embroidered badge. Therapy dog, Max. He didn't seem to understand the weight of that title, but when he put it on, he walked among the people as if he knew something new had begun. The eyes sparkled, the posture was firm. It was as if somehow he also felt that he finally belonged somewhere, and that place was right next to those who needed it most. And that was how Max officially became part of the therapeutic visits program. Twice a week he went with Helena to hospitals, nursing homes, support centers for people with depression, schools with neurodivergent students. Each visit was unique. Each encounter, a new chance to spread the love he kept within himself. On one of these visits, Max met Donna Carmem, a woman who had recently lost her husband and was immersed in silent mourning. She didn't want to eat. She didn't talk to the nursing home staff, nor to her children who tried to visit her. When Helena entered the place with Max, many elderly people reacted enthusiastically, but Donna Carmem remained motionless, looking at the ground. Max approached slowly, as he always did. He sat down next to her, lay down without making a sound, and stayed there, without forcing anything, just present. It took 10 minutes. Then, without looking at anyone, Donna Carmem ran her hand through his soft hair and cried. It wasn't a scandalous cry. It was silent, as if washing away something that had long been trapped. Later that afternoon, for the first time in months, she agreed to have tea with her caregivers. No one doubted that Max was responsible. There were also children. Max loved visiting schools and support centers for children with anxiety or behavior disorders. He was patient. He let his ears be touched. He lay on his back to get a laugh, and at certain times, he simply lay down next to a more withdrawn child, waiting for her moment. One of the teachers said that Max taught about time, because unlike the rush that the world imposes, Max respected other people's time, without demanding, without pressuring. He was just there, saying with his body, "I'm with you, in your time, in your way." Every day, Max's name became better known, but it was never about fame. It was never about turning pain into a showcase. It was about service, about purpose. Max, who previously crawled in blood and silence along the side of a road, now walked firmly through hospital corridors, carrying with him an energy that calmed even the most skeptical. And even with all this transformation, Max remained the same in essence. That caramel dog, with its deep eyes and giant heart, was still the one that sat at Donna Lucia's door years ago, waiting for a gesture of love. It just evolved, without losing its essence. And perhaps that's the most beautiful thing. Even after everything, Max never hardened. It never became cold. He never let pain turn him into bitterness. In fact, he did the opposite. He took pain and turned it into something useful, into something bigger. He gave back to the world what the world had taken from him, but twice as much, in the form of affection, of connection, of healing. And it's impossible not to wonder, where does this power come from? How can a being who doesn't use words so deeply touch those who are almost losing their faith? The answer is perhaps simple and at the same time great. Max is pure love. And love, when it is true, heals. With each new mission as a therapy dog, Max seemed to grow stronger, not because he didn't feel tired, but because each encounter replenishes something inside him, as if he finally understood why he had to go through all that, as if all the pain now had a meaning, and he carried this meaning in his eyes. That same look that once asked for help now conveyed peace. That same injured body was now a shelter for so many broken souls. Max became not just a therapy dog, it became a symbol, a living reminder that it is possible to rise up, that even in the cruelest scenarios, it is still possible to choose love. But destiny, as always, still had more surprises in store for Max. And the next one, no one could have imagined. Do you believe that forgiveness can be born from a silent look? That even after everything that has been done, all the pain, all the cruelty, all the trauma, it is still possible to heal not only those who were hurt, but also those who hurt? Max had already transformed a lot of things. He had transformed his own life, he had transformed the environments he passed through, he had even transformed the way people saw animals. But what he would experience on that specific day, no one expected. Not even Helena, the psychologist who accompanied him on every visit as a therapy dog. It was just another afternoon, another mission of affection and silent listening in a juvenile rehabilitation center. Max was used to this type of environment, suspicious looks, withdrawn or rebellious young people, and sometimes hearts as wounded as the bodies he had met on the streets. That center was no different. Boys between 14 and 17 years old, most of them with difficult pasts, coming from harsh realities, with mistakes too big for their young age, mistakes that society did not forgive easily. But there, in that space where the attempt to start over was still breathing, Helena believed that Max could also be a bridge. And that's exactly what he did. He passed among the young people, let himself be touched, lay down next to those who needed to shut up their minds for a few minutes. And it worked. It always worked. Until it happened. Max was walking calmly down the hallway when he suddenly stopped. His body remained still. The tail, which used to wag gently, remained steady. The eyes focused on a specific point in the room. Helena, noticing the behavior, stopped too. He looked at what had caught his attention, and then he saw the boy. He was sitting alone, head down, hands folded in his lap. He didn't react like the others. He didn't show curiosity, nor a desire to interact. He seemed to carry an invisible weight, greater than his teenage shoulders could bear, and Max recognized it. There was no sound, there was no barking, just silence, dense, filled with something that no one there could understand. Helena's breath caught. She felt that there was something different at that moment, but she still didn't. Know what? Max took a step and then another, slowly, cautious, but not hesitant. He walked towards the boy as if returning to an old place, not to relive the pain, but to transform it. The boy looked up, and everything stopped. It was there, in that second, that two worlds collided. The boy's eyes widened and the air left his lungs. He recognized Max instantly. The dog he had dragged behind a motorbike, the animal he almost killed, the being he tried to erase. But there he was, standing, whole, with the same serene, calm, and inexplicably gentle look. The boy's heart raced. He wanted to run away, scream, disappear. He wanted to go back in time and erase that day from his life. But he couldn't, because Max kept getting closer. No rush, no threat, no fear. And then, in front of everyone, Max lay down. He lay down at the feet of the boy who hurt him, with the head resting on the front paws, eyes closed, body relaxed. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with profound meaning. I remember, but I didn't come to collect, I came to heal." The boy couldn't take it. The tears came like an avalanche. He sobbed. She lowered her face and cried with a pain that wasn't just regret. It was shame. It was guilt. It was the weight of what he had done being brought to light not by harsh words or punishments, but by the silent gesture of someone who had every reason to hate and yet chose to forgive. Max didn't judge him. He didn't look away. He didn't move away. He stayed there, lying, there present. His calm breathing contrasted with the boy's convulsive crying. And in that moment, without needing to say anything, Max saved him. It was the first moment of genuine humanity that young man had experienced since he was admitted there. For the first time he felt the real weight of his act, not because of the punishments he received, nor because of the legal proceedings, but through the pure look of a victim who, instead of fighting back, offered peace. Helena, who watched everything with teary eyes, knew she was facing something rare, one of those moments that change a life, not just Max's, but from everyone who was there. Because it wasn't just about the reunion between perpetrator and victim. It was about the power of forgiveness when it comes not from the top down, but from equal to equal, from soul to soul. In the days that followed, the boy asked to take care of Max during visits. I wanted to take him to the other inmates. I wanted to exchange blame for action. Every step he took next to the dog was as if he was saying, "I'm not the same anymore." And Max let him. I walked with him. He let himself be guided, even though he was the one, deep down, guiding. The story of that meeting spread through the center's corridors. Inspectors who had previously been skeptical of animal therapy were now urging Max to return. The young man, previously isolated and aggressive, began to demonstrate empathy, respect, and responsibility. Little by little he became closer to humanity itself, and it all started at that moment when Max, instead of running away, chose to lie down. Perhaps he did not understand all the meanings of forgiveness. Maybe I didn't know what justice, redemption, or a fresh start were. But he knew love, and that was enough. Max taught something we often forget. Forgiving is not forgetting. It's not ignoring. It's looking into the eyes of pain and saying, "You don't define me." It's refusing to carry the weight of hate. It's about freeing yourself, and if possible, freeing others. And that's what he did. On that cold floor of a rehabilitation center, between tears and silence, a new chance was born, a new life, a new story. Not just for Max, not just for the boy, but for all of us, who upon hearing this account are invited to remember, forgiveness has the power to heal where no other force can reach. And Max continues, loyal to your mission, bringing love where once there was only pain, but his heart now carries. More than resilience, it carries the sacred power to transform even the darkest of pasts into light. Have you ever found yourself thinking about how some beings have the ability to teach more through silence than any long, beautiful speech? How sometimes does the greatest lesson in humanity come not from people, but from a sincere look, from a presence that doesn't judge, from a love that demands nothing in return? Max is that kind of being. Not just a puppy, as many would say. Not just one, a survivor, but so many others spread across the streets and shelters. Max is a symbol, a living story that carries at every step a message that touches more than words ever could. It is the reminder that love, the true, the pure, the one that is born without interests, still survives, even after everything. Throughout this journey that began with pain, went through fear, went through abandonment, and reached forgiveness, Max showed us something essential. Wounds do not need to be the end of the story. They can be the beginning. They can be the root of a transformation that blossoms where you least expect it. Because Max not only survived cruelty, he made it the soil in which his most beautiful mission grew. When we remember that dog lying on the ground, with its body marked by open wounds and glassy eyes, it is difficult to believe that we are talking about the same animal that today enters hospitals, schools, and therapeutic centers bringing peace. The pain left marks, yes. The scars are still there. Some visible, others hidden, but Max never hid behind them. On the contrary, he carries them with the dignity of someone who understands that we are not what they did to us. We are what we choose to do with what happened to us. And he chose love. It's curious to think about this because if he were a human, perhaps many would say that he would have every reason to take revenge, to fear, to stay away. But Max didn't follow that path. He didn't hold any grudges. He did not harbor anger. He didn't let hate shape who he would become. And that in itself is a lesson. One of those things that we don't learn about in books, but that completely changes the way we see the world. Max teaches us that forgiveness is not weakness. It is strength. That affection is not naivety. It is choice. And that love, when it is real, survives. It survives abandonment, suffering, the silence of those who did not help, the contempt of those who turned away, survive pain and flourish in hope. Because that's exactly what he did. He turned his own pain into hope for others. And if you look closely, how many of us also carry invisible wounds? Traumas that don't bleed, but hurt every day? How many of us haven't been dragged at some point by the cruelty of the world? Maybe not for a rope and a motorcycle like Max, but for the harsh words, for the losses we didn't choose, for the silences that hurt more than screams. And if Max was able, with everything he's experienced, to stand up, look ahead and offer love, and can't we too? Max is not an isolated case. He is a mirror, a reflection of what we can all be when we decide not to define ourselves by pain. He invites us, every day, to look at our own wounds with more compassion, understanding that even though we are broken, we are still capable of building something beautiful, that even when we think there is nothing left, a sincere desire to start over can still emerge within us. The beauty of Max's story lies precisely in this, the simplicity of the gesture, in the look that does not condemn, in the tale that shakes even after everything, in lying silently at the feet of those who made mistakes, offering forgiveness in the form of presence. It's this kind of love that changes the world, a love that doesn't scream, doesn't demand, doesn't wait for applause, just loves. And maybe, deep down, that's what we all need, of a love like that, a love that welcomes us, even when we make mistakes. Give us a second chance, without pointing the finger. May it teach us that it is worth trusting again, even if we have been hurt. Max lived it. Max was it. And today, he invites us to do the same. It doesn't matter where you came from, what they did to you, or how many times you fell. If there's one thing Max's story shows us clearly, it's that the choice to stand up is still in our hands, that every scar can become a bridge, that pain, however cruel it may be, does not have to be the end. It could be the beginning of a new mission. Max came into our lives like a hurt dog silenced by pain. Today he is a voice, it's light. It's a living reminder that true love doesn't just survive cruelty, it wins, always wins. And if he could do it, why couldn't we do it too? Max is more than a story. Max is an invitation, a silent call to be better, to see beyond appearances, to listen with our hearts, for us to understand that sometimes what heals is not what we say, but what we are, and that each one of us with our own pains and battles can also be like him, someone who instead of closing himself off, chose to open his chest and love, even when no one expected it. And the most beautiful, Max didn't do this to be a hero, he just followed what his heart said. And maybe, just maybe, it's time for us to follow ours too. If this story touched your heart in some way, if it made you reflect, if it moved you, or even inspired you to look at the world with more compassion, then it has already served its purpose. And the most beautiful thing about it all is that now you can multiply this transformation. When you like the video and subscribe to the channel, what you are doing is helping this message reach more people who, like you, may need a story like Max's to rekindle hope within themselves. It's a simple gesture, but with a huge impact. Write the word here in the comments, fresh start, just that. So I know that you have been with me this far and in some way connected with everything that was experienced in this story. It will be special to see you there. And look, if this journey has already been strong for you, wait until you know what comes next. The next video is already appearing on the screen, and in it, you will discover the surprising outcome of a story that no one imagined would end this way. I can only say one thing: you will get goosebumps. See you there.